tall, straight, stiff-looking statues are life-size. They used to be colorfully painted and full of carefully carved detail. Due to the vandals, they don't have faces anymore. Few have hands or feet, and much of the detail is lost. Despite all this, art historian Dixie Webb says the power of the work still holds.
They just popped up out of nowhere. You're driving along this country road with beautiful valleys, and suddenly here are these very large concrete figures lined up as if they're meant to be seen along the road, as if you're meant to stop, get out of the car, and take a moment to look.
Enoch Tanner Wickham was the man responsible for the monuments. Tanner represents the fourth generation of the Wickham family, which came to Clarksville in the late 1700s. Tanner was born in 1884. He owned a lot of land, had a sixth-grade education, farmed most of his life, and raised a large family. By 1959, after his wife died and his children were married and out of the house, he started building statues alongside a stretch of his land. By the time he died in the early 70s, he made 50 sculptures.
He said 100 years from now, these statues will still be here and I'll be gone. And sometimes you want to cry because they're gone.
I remember the very first time that I had heard of Tanner Wickham and had the great opportunity to meet him was when I was a student at Austin Peay with Olin Bryant, who was head of the sculpture department at that time. And we were students, doing a variety of projects and working along. And then all of a sudden, Olin would say, I want to take you out and we're going to meet someone that I think you're going to enjoy. So he'd haul 2 or 3 carloads of us together with our sack lunches, and we'd go out in the country. And there, lo and behold, was this incredible collection of sculpture and objects that was being put together and assembled by this wonderful curmudgeon of a character, Tanner Wickham.
Some of them, enjoyed them. Some of them reacted, the fact that it was an assignment. One of the most memorable papers was a very sassy young woman hadn't wanted to go, and she just did hers as a narrative, and she the outrage of being required to go, and I'd said it wasn't very far, and she said she started going, and it was miles and miles out in the woods, and she got there and these ugly things were there, and she was very editorial. She felt very put upon and sort of outraged.
And we looked at these things and thought they were pretty doggone marvelous. And they were large, they were well constructed, and really impressive objects. So we were very, very excited to have this opportunity. And I had been exposed briefly we had been to Henry Ford Museum when I was a kid. My father used to take us all over the countryside. So we were at Dearborn, and I had been exposed to some 17th and 18th century folk art at that time, but we had never been exposed to much contemporary art, and much less knew or heard of outsider art. And that was the Wickham, my first Wickham experience was probably about 68 or 69. And it wasn't until I went to Cranbrook and got a master's in contemporary sculpture and met Michael Hall, who was putting together a really important collection of 20th, late 19th, and early 20th century folk sculpture and painting, that I began to appreciate what we had been looking at as students down in the hills in Palmyra, Tennessee.
It's very smart and very chic to do that kind of thing now. It's one of the wonders and wickedness of democracy and public education. People have become very promiscuous and very democratic in their appreciation and accepting of art. And today there are all these agencies that are promoting outsider art, primitive art, whatever, folk art. It's okay, but it gets kind of absurd at some point.
The figures he makes are of common folk or common experiences, blue jeans, etc. Or they're the heroes in his mind of the common folk. Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett. He's expressing something, I think, there about the dignity of the people's lives that he understands.
A lot of people were under the impression that Grandpa wasn't all there, and that's a misconception.
The only thing that Dad did besides farming or raise tobacco, man, was they used to, now they call it real estate. Back then it was land speculators, because that's how Grandpa Nathaniel Wickham got all this land. He was a speculator too, and he had a lot of land besides what was here. It's either 5,000 or 7,000 acres. And Dad was, he bought land and resold a lot of it. And that's the way he made his living on it, raising garden, raise corn, tobacco, mainly tobacco to sell. But he didn't work out nowhere.
Grandpa went over to the Mr. Stinson's house across Yellow Creek. And anyway, it had been raining and the creek was backed up a little bit, but it wasn't deep. And he asked Mr. Stinson if he could buy 2 ox or 2 steers from him. And he said, sure. And he said, pick out a couple. And he said, that's fine. And Grandpa told him, and he said, no, I don't know when I'll be able to pay you for these. And he said, your word's good as your bond, you know. And so he said, now, Tanner, he says, I'm going to tell you something about when you get down there to Yellow Creek. He said, now, those steers will not go across the water. I don't care what you do. You can throw rocks, beat them, and everything else, and it won't go across the river or the creek. And Grandpa said, that's the only problem we got. He says, fine, I'll see you later, and I'll get you paid for these things. Well, Mr. Stinson and his boy that told me the story, he said, Daddy put me on a mule, and he said, I've got to see this. And they rode the mule down to Yellow Creek. And Grandpa put my dad up on top of one of the steers, walked around and back, and tied the steer's tails together. Walked them right out in the water, up on the other side, untied their tails. And he said he never would have believed it if he hadn't seen it. And what it did, I had no earthly idea. But it's the darndest thing I ever heard of. I don't know what it did. But anyway, got him across the river, across the creek.
My grandfather had a powerful influence on my life. I remember when I was quite young, maybe age 10 or so, he had my brothers and I out to his place to help tend the garden. And so we learned how to do that, how to grow things. And he would always say, you never know when you might need to know how to grow a garden for your food. And so I learned that from him and a lot of other things.
Grandpa had an old Tom Turkey, and me and that Tom Turkey didn't get along. And every time we'd go down to visit Grandpa, that turkey would single me out. And after about 4 or 5 times of Grandpa standing there laughing about it, I decided, well, I'll take care of this myself. And I took a tobacco stick to his head, and he left me alone after that. So Grandpa never would take up for me. He decided, you know, fend for yourself.
He liked to work in concrete, and I don't know just how he got started in that. I know that he did a lot of work in concrete early on in building a concrete porch to his house, and so he laid concrete blocks in building the house that I and my family lived in. So he had some practical experience in mixing the concrete and using the concrete, but using it to make statues was kind of a new thing. But he had this artistic talent, and he wanted to make use of it, and this type of medium was what he chose. He might have had some inspiration from seeing concrete statues in Coleman, Alabama, where my aunt was a nun. They had a convent there, and there was a priest or someone there who made statues, not really that large as life-size, but grottos with some, I think, concrete figures. So maybe he had inspiration from that. One of the first statues that he made was of a Cherokee Indian, and I think he got the inspiration to do that from maybe a trip that he took with my uncles to the Smoky Mountains, North Carolina, where he saw some Cherokee Indians and so forth. So he had worked in concrete long before he started making statues.
One reason that those things have fared so badly is that from a technical standpoint they weren't very proficiently built. Concrete's very difficult to work. It's very difficult to add concrete to concrete, and he sort of modeled these, and this is why they became vulnerable. They were easily broken, and that was part of it. And some of the armatures were not very sophisticated. That made them vulnerable.
It seems to me what is going on in what I can see there is a strong feeling for the competence and dignity